Hi, and welcome to this section of the tutor where we're going to tackle the problem that gives a lot of people difficulty, and that is how to divide decimals, okay? We've already learned how to divide using long division back in the earlier part of the class here, okay? So if you don't know how to do that, definitely need to go back and learn that now, because this is going to be a little bit more challenging, but in the end, if you know how to do that, as far as doing the long division that we talked about in the first parts of the class, then dividing decimals really isn't going to be that hard. So let's go ahead and do a problem, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. What if you have 3.45 divided by 2, and you want to divide this guy, okay? Well, the first thing you do is just like in the other problems, you go ahead and write your 3.45 under the house, and your 2 on the outside, because that's what you're going to divide in. And every time you have a division problem, you take this decimal point and you go ahead and you put a decimal right on top of the line. Because in the end, you're going to put numbers here, and the decimal point is going to be fixed, okay? You're not going to move that. So you just take your decimal point, you just put it above the line, okay? And the only way you can really describe how to do this is to work a lot of problems, so that's what we're going to do, okay? Just like before, you say, how many times can 2 go into 3? The answer is 1 time, because 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 times 2 would be 4, and that's too many times. So it can only go 1 time. So we multiply, and 1 times 2 is 2. We draw our line, okay? Now we do some subtraction like we always do. 3 minus 2 is going to give us 1, okay? And you ask yourself, can 2 go into 1, okay? The answer is no, it really can't. But before we give up, we're going to take this 4 and we're going to drop it down and make it a 14. And this is all exactly the same as what we've done when we divided numbers in the beginning of this class. So go back there if you don't quite understand this. We're going to drop this 4 down. Now the next question we ask is, can 2 go into 14? Okay? The answer is yes, it can go 7 times. Why? Because 7 times 2 is 14. Okay? So you multiply and you write that down, and you subtract, and you're going to get a 0, because 14 minus 14 is 0. Can 2 go into 0? Well, no, of course it can't, but before we give up, we're going to drop down this 5. Okay, we're allowed to drop down one number from the next column anytime you can't divide what you have here, okay? We ask ourselves, can 2 be divided into 5? The answer is yes, it can go 2 times, because 2 times 2 gives us 4, okay? Because 2 times 2 gives us 4. And we subtract, like always, 5 minus 4 gives you 1. Now here's where the decimal stuff starts to get a little bit tricky. The next thing we do is we try, will 2 be divided into 1? Well, the answer is no, you can't do that, okay? But in decimals, there's no more digits over here that you can see that you can drop down to help yourself. But in decimals, you're allowed to add a 0. In fact, you're allowed to add as many zeros as you need. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a 0 up there, and we're going to drop that 0 down and make him a 10, okay? And we ask ourselves, can 2 be divided into 10? The answer is yes. It can go 5 times. 5 times 2 gives you 10, okay? And 10 minus 10 gives you 0. And since you have nothing else left down here, okay, and you have no more digits up here and nothing more to drag down, you're done. You've filled out as many digits as you can. The answer is going to be 1.725, okay? Now this is quite a bit different than what we used to do when we were dividing regular numbers. Regular numbers, when you would divide down, you could get down to a point here and you couldn't divide anymore. You had what we call a remainder, okay, and you kind of wrote that remainder down in your answer. In these kinds of problems, you're never going to have a remainder, okay? You're going to be able to divide down and down and down, and you're allowed to add digits over here and drag them down until you get a remainder of 0, or, and we'll see in another problem, you start to see some repeating pattern up here in your decimals. So if you ever got to the point where it was 1.725, 725, 725, 725, 725, we'll see some problems in a little bit, and you'll see what I'm talking about down here. But when you start getting into some repetition, then you can just stop, okay? But you're allowed to add digits to keep helping yourself out over here until you either get 0, which means basically, and you have all your digits lined up here, you can't do any more dividing, okay? Or you see a repeating pattern, okay? Long division with decimals is probably the most difficult thing in elementary math, and so we're just going to work through some more problems, and I think you'll get the hang of it. 2.25 divided by 2, okay? How do we do that? We write 2.25 underneath the house, okay? And we put 2 on the outside of the house. And then the next thing you do is you put your decimal point right above here, okay? Now you just tackle it like any other division problem. 2 divided by, goes into 2 one time. 1 times 2 gives you 2, okay? And then you just do your subtraction. 2 minus 2 gives you 0. Can 2 go into 0? Well, no, it can't, but I have another digit I can drag down, and that's going to be a 2. How many times can 2 go into 2? Again, it can only go one time. 1 times 2 gives you 2. 2 minus 2 gives you 0. Okay, so you multiply and then you subtract. Can 2 go into 0? Well, of course it can, but you can drag down your next digit, which is a 5. Can 2 go into 5? Sure, it can go 2 times. 2 times 2 gives you 4. Okay? And 5 minus 4 gives you 1. Can 2 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. And I don't have any digits left to drag down, but in decimals, I'm allowed to add zeros to the right of the decimal point, and I'm going to add this 0 down and make him a 10. Okay? Now I can do this. 2 divided into 10 goes 5 times. 2 times 5 gives you 10, and you're going to be left with 0. So there's nothing else here. There's no more digits to drag down. You were done. 1.125. Okay? So basically you keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and if you ever continue to get a number down there, you can invent a 0 and drag it down. As long as you've got a decimal point here, you can do that. Okay? Okay. What if you have 5.5 divided by 5? Okay? What you would do is you would write 5.5 and you would put a 5 out here. Then you would take your decimal point and you would write it up above there, because that never moves. And then you would try to divide. 5 can go into 5 one time, okay? Because 1 times 5 gives me 5. And now I can subtract. 5 minus 5 gives me 0. Can 5 go into 0? Well, no, it can't, okay? But I can drag down my next digit, which is a 5. Can 5 go into 5? Yes, it can, one time. 1 times 5 gives me 5. Subtract, like always. 5 minus 5 gives me a 0. Now there's nothing left here, okay? I've got all my digits filled out and there's no more digits here. There's no reason to add another 0 because I've already filled in all my digits and I've got a 0 left over there. So the answer here is 1.1. And so just like always, if you're going to check your answer, all you have to do is take 1.1 and multiply by 5. This times this should give you this. 5 times 1 would give you 5. 5 times 1 would give you 5. And for the decimal, you've only got one digit behind the decimal, so you move left one place, and then the answer will be 5.5. Okay? So it's very similar to the division you already know. Okay, you just got to keep track of these decimals. What if you had 10.75 divided by 2? Okay? You would write 10.75 divided by 2, and you would write your decimal point for your answer right above there. And then you just try like usual. Can 5 go into 10? Yes, it can, 5 times. 5 times 2 gives you 10. And then you go ahead and subtract, okay? You're going to get a 0 here, and you say, well, can 2 go into 0? No, it can't. But I go ahead and I drag my 7 down, okay? Notice I'm not doing anything with the decimal under here. Can 2 go into 7? Yes, it can. 3 times, because 3 times 2 is going to give me 6. And again, I can subtract. And I bring a 1 down. Can 2 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. But before I give up, let me go ahead and drag down my next digit, which is a 5. Now I ask, can 2 go into 15? Yes, it can. The closest I can get is 7, because 7 times 2 is 14. Okay? 7 times 2 is 14. And when I take 15, subtract 14, I'm only going to have 1 left over. Question is, can 2 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. But don't forget that in decimals, you're going to have to start adding zeros. Basically, you're always going to have a remainder of 0. So let's drag a 0 down. Can 2 go into 10? Yes, it can. 5 times. 5 times 2 gives me 10. 10 minus 10 gives me 0. So now I have a 0 down here finally, okay? And no more digits to drag down, so I'm done. I stop. 5.375. I know that this is coming fast and furious, but The only way that you can really get good at these is to do a lot of these problems. It's really the only way. What if you have 10.75 divided by 3? Okay? Well, you write 10.75, you're dividing by 3, and you put your decimal up there because that's where your answer is going to be. How many times can 3 go into 10? Well, it can go 3 times, because 3 times 3 is just going to give you 9, and 9 is as close to 10 as I can get. Now 10 minus 9 is just going to give me the 1, so I write that down. Can 3 go into 1? No, it can't, but before I give up, drag down my next digit, make it a 17. Can 3 go into 17? The closest I'm going to be able to get is 5, because 5 times 3 is 15. Okay, and then again I subtract. 7 minus 5 gives me 2. 1 minus 1 is 0, so I don't have to write that. So 17 minus 15 gives me 2. So the answer is, the question is, can I take 3 and divide it into 2? Well, no, I can't. So I try before I do anything else and drag another digit down. Can 3 go into 25? Can 3 go into 25? Yes, it can. It can go 8 times, because 8 times 3 is 24. Okay? 8 times 3 is 24. 25 minus 24 is just going to give me 1. Can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't, but I can, remember, add a 0 anytime I need to. We try to drag that 0 down and see what happens. And now, here's where the problem starts to get tricky. 3 divided into 10 goes how many times? Well, 3 times 3 gives me 9. That's as close as I can get. 3 times 3 gives me 9. So I write that down. And I subtract, and I get a 1 here. Okay? I get a 1 here. Well, can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. Well, I can add another 0 if I want. And I drag it down and make a 0. And I have 10 again. How many times can 3 go into 10? Well, it can only go 3. Okay? And so 3 times 3 gives me 9. 10 minus 9 gives me 1. You see, I'm in an infinite thing here. I can never get out of this problem here, okay? You see, every time I add a 0 and drag it down, I'm going to have 10, like I had right here. And every time I try to divide into 10, I'm going to have to put a 3 up here, because 3 times 3 gives me 9. But every time I do that, I'm going to subtract, I'm going to get 1, and that's going to be exactly where I start with. You see, it happened here, and then it happened here, and it's going to happen again if I keep adding zeros. So you can keep adding zeros all you want. You're never going to get anywhere, okay? So you can see I keep putting 3's up here because that's exactly what the answer is going to be because of this problem with the 10's down here. So the answer to this problem is going to be 3.58333333. It goes on. And 3's go out forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Okay? And another way to write that is 3.583, and you can put a little bar over the 3, and that tells you that the 3 goes on forever. The 5.8 doesn't go on forever, but the 3 goes on forever. So now I can say with a little more confidence to you, now that you've seen a problem, that when you're dividing decimals, you keep going until you get a 0 here with no more digits to drop, or if you ever get caught into one of these loops where you keep adding digits because you keep getting the same thing over and over and over down here, then there's no point to continue. You just stop and say, okay, well, the answer is going to have a repeating number of 3's. Okay? Now, if you were to take this in your calculator, 10.75, and divide by 3, you would see that the 3's would go on and on and on forever. Okay? So just keep dividing and keep doing the rules that you know until you run into something that repeats or until the answer cleans itself up and is nice and neat. Let's try 7.25 divided by 3. Okay? So you have 7.25 divided by 3, and I'm going to put a decimal up there. Okay? How many times will 3 go into 7? Well, only twice, because 2 times 3 is 6. So I subtract and I put a 1 down here. Okay, can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. So I drag the 2 down. Now I have 12. Can 3 go into 12? Well, sure it can. It can go 4 times because 3 times 4 gives me 12. Now I subtract. 12 minus 12 gives me 0. Okay, can 3 go into 0? Well, no, it can't. But let me go ahead and try to drag my 5 down here and see what this does for me. Okay, 3 divided into 5 can go only 2 times because, actually, 3 into 5 can only go 1 time. 3 times 1 gives me 3. Okay? And 5 minus 3 gives me 2. Okay? Now the question is, can 3 go into 2? Well, no, it can't. So what I'm allowed to do with decimals is add a 0 and drag it down here. You can't do this unless it's a decimal, okay? So I make it a 20, okay? 3 goes into 20. How many times will 3 go into 20? I'm going to say it goes 6 times, because 6 times 3 is 18, okay? And in order to subtract this, I borrow the 1, make this a 1 here, so I have to borrow. And then 10 minus 8 is going to give me a 2, okay? Is going to give me a 2. Can 3 go into 2? Well, no, it can't, so I add another 0. I drag it down, put a 0. Well, here I had a 20 here, now I have another 20. 3 goes into 20, again, 6 times, because 6 times 3 is 18, and the same thing is going to happen. I'm going to have 2 left over. I'm getting into another one of these repeating patterns. And every time it happens, I'm going to add another 6 and another 6 and another 6, on out and on out. Here I had 20, and then I did it, and then I had another 20, and then I did it again, and I'm going to have another 20 eventually whenever I drag the 0 down. So the answer is 2.416 with a bar over the 6, and that just means that the 6's go on and on forever. It just means that the 6's go on and on forever. So this is what we mean when we say there's, keep going until you have a repeating pattern, or keep going until, your answer basically cleans itself up. What if you have 6.75 divided by 0.3? Okay? So you'd have 6.75 divided by 0.3. Well, you put your decimal point up above here. Now, look at what we have here. You have a number, a decimal, and you're dividing by another decimal. This is a little bit different kind of problem because you have a decimal divided by a decimal. But it turns out it's really, really simple, okay? In order to do this, all you do is you move this decimal point over 1 and this decimal point to the same amount over, okay? So when you rewrite your problem is going to be, when you move the 3 over there, it's going to be a 3, and then you're going to have 67.5 on the inside, and you're going to have your decimal point over here for the answer, okay? What you have done is you have transformed the problem into something you like. You always want to divide by a number that doesn't have a decimal point. So we move this decimal point 1 place to the right, and 3.0 is just going to be 3, so I can just write the 3 here. And I also have to do the same thing here. I have to move the decimal point the same number of places in each part of the problem. So I made it 67.5, and now I can go ahead and do my division. Okay, how many times will 3 go into 6? Let it go 2 times. 3 times 2 gives me 6, so I subtract. I'm going to get a 0. Can 3 go into 0? Well, no, it can't, so I drag my 7 down. Can 3 go into 7? Yes, it can. 2 times. 2 times 3 gives me 6. Okay? And again, I subtract and I get a 1. Okay? Can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't, but let me drag my next thing down, which is a 5. And then finally, can 3 go into 15? Yes, it can go 5 times because 3 times 5 gives me 15. And when I subtract these, I get 0. I've got a 0 here. I've got no more digits here to drag down. And I've got all my digits filled out here. So the answer to this problem is 22.5. The only thing you have to do if you're dividing by a decimal is move the decimal point over the enough places so you get rid of the decimal point, and you have to do the same thing underneath the division symbol. It's kind of like the fractions. As long as you do this, move the same number of decimal places in each place, then you're not going to have any problems. So working with another problem, what if you had 21.35 divided by 0.7? Okay? So it's 21.35 divided by 0.7. Now notice I'm dividing by a decimal, and I don't want that, so I'm going to move this decimal over 1, and I'm going to move this decimal over 1. So what I'm going to have is 213.5 on the inside, and I move this decimal point over to the 1, so I've got a decimal point to the right here, and you don't have to write that down because 7.0 is just 7, okay? And then you do the same thing to the inside, 213.5, so you move it over 1. You write your decimal point right above here like this. And then you ask yourself, can 7 go into 2? Well, no, it can't, so let's try both digits. Can 7 go into 21? Yes, it can go 3 times. 7 times 3 is 21. Okay? You subtract this, you get a 0. Okay? Can 7 go into 0? No, it can't, so you drag your 3 down. Can 7 go into 3? Well, since you already dragged your number down, okay, and now you're trying to ask yourself, can 7 go into 3? Well, no, it can't. It can go 0 times. Okay? Once you drag that next digit down, if you still can't divide into it, you have to put a 0 somewhere. You have to have digits everywhere here. Okay? 0 times 7 gives me 0, so I just subtract. 3 minus 0 gives me 3. And can 7 go into 3? Well, no, it can't, but before I give up, let me go ahead and drag my 5 down. Now, can 7 go into 35? Well, yes, it can, because 7 times 5 gives me 35. 7 times 5 gives me 35. Subtract. I get 0. 35 minus 35 is 0. And there's nothing left to do. I got a 0 down here. I've got all my digits filled out here. I don't have anything else to drag down. So, 213.5 divided by 7 is 30.5. Now, the last thing that I really want to talk to you about is a little bit about the relationship between fractions and decimals. Okay? Any fraction can be written as a decimal. Okay? Let me show you what I mean by that. Remember, fractions are numbers less than 1. So let's say you have the fraction 1/3. Okay? And we already talked about in terms of pies, okay? You know, that's one, if you divide this pie into 3 pieces, 1/3 of that would be what you have. That's not the best drawing, but if you divide your pie into 3 pieces, 1 piece is going to be what you have there. How would you write that as a decimal? Okay? Well, it's 1 divided by 3. That's what a fraction means. That's what this bar really means. Notice the symbol for division is this. That's kind of like a fraction, right? 1 divided by 3. So what you have is 1 underneath the house divided by 3. Okay? Now, it may not be clear what to do, but never forget that anytime you have a number, you can put a decimal and you can put some zeros over here. 1.00 is the same thing as 1. 1.000000 is the same thing as 1. You can put any number of zeros behind a decimal point, it doesn't matter. So let's go ahead and do this division and let's see what would happen. Okay? Can 3 go into 1? Okay? No, it can't, so I'll put a 0 up here. Okay? 0 times 3 gives me 0. 1 minus 0, just the same as always, is going to give you 1. Can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't, but before I give up, let me drag down my 0. Okay, I'm going to have 10. Can 3 go into 10? Well, sure it can. And you put your decimal point up above, just like you always do. 3 goes into 10 3 times. Okay? 3 times 3 gives you 9. Okay? 10 minus 9 gives me 1. Okay, just like I always do. Can 3 go into 1? Well, no, it can't. But let me go ahead and drag down my 0. Okay, like I always do. Can 3 go into 10? Yes, it can. 3 times. You see, I'm in one of these repeating patterns because every time I do this, I'm going to put a 9 down here and subtract, and I'm going to get a 1. I'm going to have to drag another 0. Here was 10, here was 10, here I'm working on doing another 10. The same thing's going to happen, so I'm going to put a bunch of 3's up here. So, 1/3 is exactly equal to 0.3333333, and the bar just means 3 repeats over and over again. Okay? So that's an example of how you have a fraction, which is a number less than 1. Here is a decimal, which is also a number less than 1. They're exactly the same thing. They're just 2 different ways of writing the same thing. And that's why sometimes fractions are useful, and that's why sometimes decimals are useful. Let's try one more. What if I had 1/4? How would I write that as a decimal? Okay? Well, I have 1, and I'm dividing by 4. And I'm going to go ahead and put a couple zeros here. I'm dividing by 4. Can 4 go into 1? No, it can't, so I'll put a 0. 0 times 4 gives me 0. And I subtract. 1 minus 0 gives me 1. Okay? Can 4 go into 1? No, it can't, so I drag down a 0. Can 4 go into 10? Only 2 times. Okay, only 2 times because 4 times 2 is 8. 10 minus 8 you can do on your fingers. 10 minus 8 is going to give you 2. Okay? Can 4 go into 2? Well, no, it can't, so I have to drag another 0 down. Can 4 go into 20? Yes, it can, 5 times. 5 times 4, go ahead and multiply, gives you 20. And when you subtract, you're just going to get 0 here. So there's no more things to do here. You have a 0, you have all your things filled out here, and you fully divided everything out. So 1/4 is equal to 0.25. That is the decimal equivalent of this fraction that we call 1/4. two different ways of writing the same thing. In any number of fractions, any fraction, you could do this way, and you could find the decimal equivalent to it. And that's what you do if you ever get a calculator out and you have to multiply by some kind of fraction. If you were to take 1 and divide by 4 in your calculator, you would see that the answer is 0.25. That's how you work with these things with computers and with a calculator, and a lot of problems you need to know how to do that.